The night shift. Forget last night, Elena Whitfield said, her voice barely above a whisper. It never happened. She sat upright on the penthouse bed, still tangled in the sheets, watching the man by the window fasten his janitor's uniform with hands that wouldn't stay steady. The envelope of cash on the nightstand sat between them, untouched, like an accusation neither of them knew how to answer. Daniel Reyes had come up to this floor to clean the suite after her party. He never planned to stay. Neither of them had planned any of it. But plans had stopped mattering somewhere around midnight, and now the morning light was asking questions neither of them was ready for. Daniel never took the elevator. He never had. The freight lift at the back of Halcyon Corporation's downtown tower was slower, louder, and smelled like cleaning solvent and old metal, but it was the one he was cleared to use on shift. He hit the button for the 40th floor and leaned against the wall beside his cart, listening to the cables groan overhead. It was past 2 in the morning. The party on the executive floor had wrapped an hour earlier, and his supervisor had pulled him aside with a look that meant it wasn't a request. Someone had to get the presidential suite cleared before the regular day crew arrived at 6. That someone was Daniel. He'd worked nights at Halcyon for 14 months. Not because he wanted to, and not because it was the only job around, but because the overnight differential paid 30% more than days, and that 30% was the difference between affording his mother's medication and not. Elena Reyes had been in and out of St. Agnes Hospital for most of the year, her heart failing in slow stages. The doctors tracked her decline in numbers. Daniel had learned to read the way other men read stock tickers. Her surgery had been scheduled and postponed twice, both times because the insurance company invented a new reason to deny it. The full cost, paid out of pocket, was a number Daniel had written on a scrap of paper and folded into his wallet so he'd never lose sight of what he was working toward, $47,000. He checked it every time he thought about quitting. The suite on the 40th floor was bigger than his entire apartment. He'd been up once before, months back, to fix a ventilation problem, and he remembered the floor-to-ceiling windows and how orderly the city looked from that height, like a problem someone had already solved. Tonight the room told a different story. Half-empty champagne flutes crowded every surface, a catering cart sat abandoned by the wet bar, and one very expensive shoe lay alone in the middle of the carpet. Daniel started with the glasses, moving quietly the way he always did, keeping to the edges of the room like he was trying not to disturb the air. He heard her before he saw her, a low sound from the bedroom, somewhere between a cough and a groan. He set down his tray and crossed the suite. The bedroom door was half open. Elena Whitfield lay on top of the covers, still fully dressed, one arm thrown over her eyes against the city light pouring in. Daniel knew her the way anyone who worked in the building knew her, from the framed portrait in the lobby, from the company-wide email photos, from the way an entire floor went quiet whenever she walked through it. She was the CEO. 32 years old, running a company with 17,000 employees, and currently sprawled sideways across a king bed with smudged mascara and an empty glass loose in her hand. He backed out and returned to the living room. He'd clean what he could out here and leave the bedroom for morning. That was the sensible call. He was halfway through restacking the catering cart when he heard her try to stand and knock something off the nightstand. Then silence. Then a small, quiet sound he recognized without wanting to, as someone crying and trying not to. He stood still in the middle of the suite for a long moment. Then he went to the kitchenette, filled a glass with water, and knocked on the bedroom doorframe before stepping in. Elena turned her head toward him. Her eyes were unfocused, her expression cycling fast, confusion, irritation, embarrassment, before landing somewhere closer to exhaustion. Daniel set the glass on the nightstand, picked up whatever had fallen without looking at it, and turned to go. She said something he didn't catch. He turned back. "What do you want?" she asked again. It wasn't hostile, it was the voice of someone who hadn't asked that question in a long time and wasn't sure why she was asking it now. He told her he was there to clean the suite, that was all, and she could go back to sleep and he'd work around her. She looked at him for a beat. Then she laughed, quietly and without much humor, and said that was the most honest thing anyone had said to her all night. The party had been wall-to-wall people telling her exactly what she wanted to hear. She'd drunk too much because it was easier than listening to them. Daniel didn't answer that. He started gathering glasses from the bedroom surfaces, stacking them carefully so they wouldn't clink. Elena watched him work. After a while she asked his name. He told her. She told him hers, and he said he already knew, and she said of course he did. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. What happened next wasn't something Daniel could explain cleanly, even to himself. It started with her asking him to stay a little longer, just to talk, because the quiet in that room was a very specific kind of awful and she was tired of sitting in it alone. It turned into a conversation that ran longer than it should have, one where she asked real questions and actually listened to the answers, and something in the room shifted in a way Daniel couldn't account for. Elena was sharp and funny in a way she seemed to have forgotten she was, and Daniel was too worn down that night to bother performing indifference. By the time she said his name again, it wasn't the way someone says the name of the person cleaning their room. In the morning, Daniel stood at the window in his uniform when Elena woke. They looked at each other and both understood that nothing that had happened could be undone. She hadn't touched the envelope on the nightstand. Neither had he. He didn't yet know how to explain why. Elena sat up slowly. "Are you going to take responsibility for me?" she asked. Daniel had no answer, not because the question was unfair, but because it didn't have a clean yes or no, and they both knew it. She ran the company he mopped floors for. He was a man carrying a scrap of paper with $47,000 written on it. That gap wasn't something either of them could talk their way around at 6 in the morning with the city still gray outside the glass. So Elena did what felt safest. She told him she'd handle it from her end. She thanked him. She said it had been a hard night and that she'd appreciated his company, and the careful way she phrased it closed a door Daniel hadn't realized was open. When he left, the envelope was still on the nightstand. She noticed. Daniel went home, showered, changed, and drove to St. Agnes to sit with his mother before his next shift. Eleanor was awake that morning, which wasn't always true anymore. She was watching the window the same way Daniel had been watching one an hour earlier from a different building entirely. When he walked in, she looked at him the way mothers look at sons when they know something's wrong but understand that asking outright won't get them a straight answer. He sat beside her bed and they talked about nothing, the weather, a nurse with a good laugh, the book on her nightstand she hadn't gotten far into because her eyes tired fast now. He held her hand and tried not to think about the 40th floor. Mostly, he failed. When he left, Eleanor squeezed his hand once and told him to take care of himself, same as always. This time it landed differently. 3 days later, a patient advocate at St. Agnes called Daniel. Not the insurance company, someone working his mother's case, to say an anonymous third-party payment had cleared the full outstanding cost of her surgery. The advocate was careful with her words, the way people are when they've been told to be, and she couldn't confirm the source. Daniel asked twice. He got the same careful non-answer twice. He sat in his car in a gas station lot and stared at the number in his wallet for a long time. He thought about the envelope he hadn't touched. He thought about the fact that Elena had noticed. He didn't call her. He didn't know what he'd have said. The surgery happened the following Thursday. Eleanor came through it, not easily, not without cost, but she came through. Daniel spent 6 hours in the waiting room drinking bad coffee, staring at the floor, not thinking about Elena, and then thinking about nothing else. When the surgeon told him his mother was stable, he put his face in his hands and stayed like that a while. No one in the room said a word, because everyone there understood exactly what that posture meant. He went back to work the following Monday. The 40th floor was just the 40th floor again. He rode the freight elevator, kept to the edges of rooms, and told himself the whole thing was a closed chapter. He'd done what he needed to for his mother. Whatever it cost him, he'd carry it quietly. It was the only kind of deal a man in his position knew how to make. 3 weeks into believing that, he stepped onto an elevator and found himself 2 feet from Elena for the first time since that night. She wore a charcoal blazer, phone in hand, and looked at him with a kind of controlled recognition that gave away more than she meant it to. They rode down 12 floors in a silence that said more than either of them intended. The doors opened at the lobby, she stepped out first without a word. Daniel watched her go and told himself, again, that the chapter was closed. Except Elena, one of the sharpest executives in the city for a decade, someone who ran her calendar like a military operation and never missed a meeting, had been leaving her office early every day for 2 weeks. Mornings made her nauseous. She was exhausted by noon. She'd booked a doctor's appointment under a different name at a clinic across town. When the results came back, she sat in her car in the parking lot and read the page 3 times before she let herself believe the number on it. 8 weeks along. She drove back to the tower, went up to the 40th floor, and stood in her office a long time, looking at the skyline. She'd steered this company through a market crash, a hostile takeover attempt, and a board restructuring that should have finished her. She'd survived every version of hard the business world could throw at her. This was a different kind of hard, the kind that never shows up on a balance sheet, and she had no framework for it. That night, alone with the city dark outside her window, she made a decision. She was keeping the pregnancy. She wasn't telling Daniel. He'd agreed to that night out of a kind of desperation she understood better than he realized, and pulling him into something he never signed up for wasn't something she was willing to do. She'd manage it herself. She'd managed everything else herself. No reason this should be different. She believed that for about 3 more weeks, until the morning sickness stopped being something she could plan around, and around the same time, the man who mopped her floor started leaving a plain cup of ginger tea outside her office door every morning before she arrived. No note. No signature. Just a warm cup from the building's basement cafeteria. Elena picked it up the first morning and stood in her doorway scanning the empty corridor. She already knew whose shift had just ended. The tea kept appearing, same cup, same spot, always still warm, meaning whoever left it had timed his exit carefully. She told herself she'd stop taking it. She took it every morning. She told herself it meant nothing. She knew it didn't. Daniel hadn't spoken to her directly since the elevator. He moved through the 40th floor the way he always had. Efficient, half invisible, the kind of presence high-functioning offices depend on and rarely notice. But Elena noticed things now she hadn't before: how he refilled the water station outside the conference room before her 7 a.m. calls without being asked, how he dimmed the hallway lights on mornings after she'd had a late night, as if he understood that bright fluorescence at 6 a.m. on 4 hours of sleep were a specific kind of cruelty. He never looked at her in a way that demanded acknowledgement. He just adjusted things quietly and moved on. By the 8th week, the nausea was bad enough that Elena kept crackers in her desk drawer and closed her office door in the mornings. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya Shah, noticed and said nothing, which Elena appreciated more than she could say. The rest of the floor noticed too, the way offices always do. Through rerouted meetings and shifted schedules and the particular quiet that settles over a workplace watching something it hasn't been given permission to discuss yet. One morning, Elena made it only as far as the hallway bathroom before the nausea hit. She was on her knees against the tile when the door opened. She expected Priya's voice, or no one's. Instead, she heard someone filling a cup at the sink, and a damp paper towel appeared over the top of the stall door, held out without comment. She took it. The footsteps retreated. The door closed. She stayed where she was for a moment, the cool towel against her neck, already certain who had just walked out. She found Daniel in the supply room off the east corridor 20 minutes later, restocking shelves. He didn't turn when she came in, though he'd clearly heard her. She stood in the doorway and told him she knew it was him leaving the tea. He turned then, meeting her eyes with the same steadiness that had unsettled her that first morning. Yes, it was him. She asked why. He said she looked like she needed it. She crossed her arms and told him he didn't have to do that. He agreed that he didn't. A silence sat between them that wasn't uncomfortable, which was itself uncomfortable. Then she told him she was handling things, that she didn't need anyone managing anything on her behalf. He said he understood, and turned back to the shelves. She stood in the doorway a beat longer than she needed to before she left. The talk started the following week. Daniel heard it first from a maintenance guy named Gus, delivered with the cheerful bluntness of someone who assumed everybody already knew. The story going around was that the executive floor janitor had figured out the CEO was pregnant and was working the angle, maneuvering, calculating, playing it for whatever he could get. Gus said it without malice, the way people repeat things they find interesting rather than things they actually believe. But what Gus passed along was the tame version. What was circulating in the building's group chats, Daniel learned later, was considerably less generous. He didn't defend himself to Gus. He didn't raise it with his supervisor. He went back to the 40th floor, kept leaving the tea, and carried on with his shift because stopping, pulling back, letting the talk win, felt like the wrong answer even if he couldn't fully explain why. What happened in the parking garage 3 weeks later wasn't something he'd planned. Elena had been in meetings back-to-back since 8 that morning, and it was close to 10 at night when Daniel saw her walking to her car alone on the lower level. It was raining. The garage entrance sat 100 feet from where she'd parked, and she had no umbrella. Daniel had a plain black umbrella that lived on his cart for the 5-block walk to his bus stop. He walked over, held it above her without a word, and matched her pace to the car. She unlocked the door, put her bag inside, then straightened and looked at him standing in the rain, holding the umbrella out at arm's length so it covered her and not him. She told him to get in out of the rain. He said he was fine. She said he was soaked, which was true. She said she'd drive him to his stop. He started to refuse. She said she wasn't asking. He got in, dripping quietly onto the leather seat, and she pulled out of the garage without speaking for a long stretch. At a red light on 5th, she told him about the board review, not framed as a request for input or reassurance, just stated the way she stated most things, fact, with context. The board had noticed irregularities in her schedule, unexplained absences, a pattern of leaving meetings early. Someone had connected the dots to the rumors moving through the building. They hadn't asked her outright yet, but she could see where it was headed. She said all of it staring straight at the traffic. When she finished, Daniel asked if the company was going to be all right, not her, the company. She glanced at him sideways and said the company was fine, she'd handled worse than board scrutiny. He said then she already knew what she was doing and probably didn't need him to say anything. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and kept driving. He got out at his stop. She watched him go and told herself, again, that she was handling this alone. She'd built Halcyon from a failing regional firm into a national name over 8 years, without a partner, without a safety net, without anyone driving her home through the rain. One more hard season wasn't going to be what changed that. She told herself the same thing twice more in the elevator on her way up. The prenatal appointment was at a clinic off Mercer Street, the same one from her first visit. She'd been going alone, scheduling around board calls and investor briefings, telling Priya she had a personal matter those mornings and leaving it there. The folder was still in her bag when she got back to the office. She set it on her desk and turned away to take a call, not noticing the loose clasp until she came back and found it open on the floor, the appointment paperwork face up. Daniel had come in to swap the recycling. He was on the far side of the room, back turned, when Elena rounded the corner and saw the file on the floor. She grabbed it, not quickly enough. The top sheet had been visible to anyone in that room for the last 30 seconds. She looked at him. He was still working, still moving, not turning around, but his rhythm had shifted by one small beat, and she'd watched him work long enough to know the difference. She said his name. He turned. His expression was careful in a way that told her everything about what he'd seen. She set the file on her desk, stood straighter than necessary, and told him that whatever he thought he knew, she was managing the situation, it wasn't his concern, and she needed him to keep what he'd seen to himself. He said he would. Then he said, and she'd turned this sentence over in her head for a long time afterward, that she didn't have to manage it alone if she didn't want to. She told him that wasn't something she was prepared to discuss. He said he understood, finished with the recycling, and moved for the door. Then, without quite meaning to, she said she'd been considering a transfer, moving her primary base to the company's Hartford branch, at least for a few months. She didn't have a clean answer. The elevator arrived, he held the door, she didn't get in. He looked at her a moment, then let the doors close and rode down alone. She stood in the corridor a long time after that, in the quiet of the building at 10 at night, thinking about the envelope he'd never touched, the umbrella held out in the rain, the tea that showed up warm every single morning. Then she thought about Thursday's session, the 4% drop, the Hartford office, and all the clean, logical reasons she'd spent weeks assembling to convince herself the safest choice was also the right one. Standing there, she realized she was no longer sure those were the same thing. The call came on a Tuesday, 6 days after the board session. Daniel was mid-shift when his phone buzzed and St. Agnes lit up the screen. He knew before he answered what kind of call it was. Eleanor had been declining for 2 weeks in the slow, incremental way the doctors had warned him about: a dropping rhythm here, a climbing fluid reading there, numbers on a chart telling a story he'd been reading in her face for months. The surgery had bought time. It hadn't bought permanence. He'd understood that. He'd told himself he was ready for it. He wasn't ready for it. He left without signing out, drove to a St. Agnes in the dark before dawn, and sat with his mother through the last 2 hours of her life, holding her hand while the monitors registered what was left, and then registered nothing. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something has just left it. He sat in the chair beside the empty bed a long time after the nurses had come and gone. He wasn't crying. He was past the point where that was available to him. He was just sitting with the weight of it, letting it settle into his body the way grief does when it has nowhere left to go. He didn't go back to work that week. He used the bereavement days he'd never touched in 14 months and went home to an apartment that was suddenly very quiet. Eleanor hadn't lived with him, she'd kept her own place across the city for 30 years, but she'd been such a constant presence in his life that her absence had texture. He felt it most in the mornings, in the half-second of almost reaching for his phone to call her before he remembered. On the third day, he went to her apartment to start sorting her things, the kind of task that expands to fill whatever time you give it. He moved through it carefully, without hurry, opening drawers with the deliberateness of someone who understood that what was inside wouldn't be there much longer. In the second drawer of her nightstand, under a worn Bible and a folder of insurance papers, he found the letters. 6 of them, handwritten on plain paper in his mother's careful cursive, each one sealed with his name on the front. Undated, but the shakier handwriting on the last 2 told him roughly when she'd written them. He sat on the edge of her bed and read them in order. By the 4th, he understood what she'd been doing. Writing to him across time, saving things for after she was gone, because she'd known, the way she always seemed to know things, that he'd need them more later than now. The letters weren't dramatic. They weren't the kind of grand farewell that would have felt foreign to who Eleanor was. They were practical and warm and honest in the way she'd always been honest, without softening what didn't need softening, without hardening what deserved tenderness. She told him she was proud of him, specifically, with examples, not as a blanket statement. She told him things she wished she'd said more while she had the chance. In the last letter, the one with the unsteady handwriting, she wrote something Daniel read twice before folding it back along its creases and sitting very still in the quiet of her apartment. She'd watched him carry things alone his whole life, she wrote, and she understood why. She knew where that came from, since she'd raised him, but carrying things alone wasn't the same as being strong, and she wanted him to know the difference before it was too late to use it. She said she didn't know exactly what was going on in his life, because he'd always been careful about what he told her, but she knew something was, and she wanted him to stop asking whether he deserved to stay and start asking whether the person in front of him needed him to. Those were different questions, she wrote, and only one of them was worth living by. He refolded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. While Daniel was on leave, the board moved faster than Elena expected. She received a formal written request, framed as a recommendation, board language for a directive, asking her to sever any personal connection to the employee in question and issue a brief public statement confirming that Halcyon maintained appropriate professional boundaries at every level of the organization. The statement had already been drafted. All it needed was her signature. She sat with the draft in her office on the 40th floor and read it 3 times. It was clean, precise, and it would work. The board knew it. She knew it. A statement like this, issued by her, would close the press cycle within 48 hours, stabilize the stock, and restore the board's confidence in her leadership. It would also make Daniel's position in the building untenable. The statement didn't say so, and didn't need to, because everyone involved understood the implication. She didn't sign it. She told herself she was waiting for a clearer head, better timing, the right conditions. She worked through the week alone, going through the motions of leadership with the practiced competence of someone who'd done this long enough to do it without being fully present. Priya left food on her desk when she forgot to eat. She ate it mechanically and kept working. The tea stopped appearing outside her door that week, the first outward sign that something in the building had changed, and it landed harder than she expected. She hadn't known about Eleanor. She found out the way most of the building did. Priya mentioned gently that there was a note going around, that the night janitor on the executive floor was out on bereavement. Elena absorbed it without visible reaction and went back to work, telling herself it didn't change the calculation. She knew immediately that it changed everything. Daniel came back on a Monday, through the freight entrance as always, signed in, took his cart, and went up to the 40th floor. 20 minutes into his shift, Elena appeared in the corridor. She wasn't supposed to be in the building. It was past 9 at night and she had a morning flight for an investor meeting on the East Coast. She was still in her coat, bag on her shoulder, which meant she'd left and turned around and come back. She told him she was sorry about his mother. He said, "Thank you." They stood in the corridor while the building settled around them the way it did at that hour, quiet and indifferent. Then she said she was sorry about the other thing too, the board, the pressure, the choice she'd been drifting toward without telling him directly. He said he already knew. She asked how. He said she'd stopped arguing against it, which was always how he could tell when she'd made up her mind about something. She looked at him for a moment, then told him she hadn't signed the statement. When he didn't respond right away, she said it again, more plainly. The board had drafted it, given her a deadline, and she hadn't signed it and didn't intend to. He asked what she planned to do instead. She said she didn't know yet. He said that was honest. She said honesty was the least she owed him at this point. She asked about the letters. Priya had mentioned something in passing about letters found among his mother's things, and she asked because she wanted to understand, not because she needed anything from the answer. He told her about them the spare way he told her most things, without performance or self-pity, just the facts and what they'd clarified for him. He told her about the last letter, not reading it aloud, but telling her what it said at its core, the difference between carrying things alone and being strong. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said quietly that his mother sounded like a remarkable woman. He said she was, without hesitation. They'd been standing in that corridor for 20 minutes, and neither of them had moved toward the other or away. She said she needed to tell him something and wanted him to let her finish before responding. He said, "All right." She told him that for months she'd been making decisions on his behalf without consulting him, deciding what he could handle, what he was better off not knowing, how much of this he'd actually signed up for. And that she'd told herself it was to protect him, but the more honest description was that she'd been protecting herself from the possibility that if she gave him a real, fully informed choice, he might make a different one than the one she needed him to make. He listened. He let her finish. Then he said that he'd already made his choice, that he'd made it the morning he left the envelope on the nightstand and walked out without it, and that he hadn't changed his mind since. The board session was the following Thursday. It had been scheduled as a routine governance meeting, the kind Elena attended the way she attended every obligation, prepared, controlled, 3 steps ahead of the room. What wasn't scheduled was Daniel Reyes walking through the doors of Halcyon's 38th floor boardroom at 9:40 that morning, in a clean shirt, wearing the same steady expression he wore everywhere, asking to address the board. 2 directors objected immediately. Elena, at the head of the table, let the objection run its course, then said without inflection that she chaired this meeting, and she was granting the floor. The room went quiet. Daniel stood at the end of the table without notes. He said he wasn't there to defend a relationship or make a case for himself as someone worth the board's time. He said he understood exactly what he was. The night janitor, the man with the cleaning cart, the one who rode the freight elevator so he wouldn't inconvenience the people whose floors he mopped. He understood how that looked from where they sat, and he wasn't asking them to see it differently. What he was asking was that they consider one thing separately from the rest, that Elena Whitfield was one of the most capable people in the industry, and that the thing she'd been doing for years, operating entirely alone, treating self-sufficiency like a virtue instead of a survival habit, was going to cost the company more in the long run than any optics problem the board was worried about. He said a person with nobody to go home to eventually stops going home, and his CEO running on empty isn't an asset. He wasn't asking them for a title, a seat, or anything that belonged to them. He was asking them to stop making it harder for her to let someone in. The room stayed quiet after he finished. One senior director, a woman named Margot Feldman who'd sat on the board since before Elena's tenure, looked at him for a long moment, then at Elena, and said nothing, though her expression said plenty. Elena, for her part, was looking at the table. Daniel thanked them for their time and walked out. The vote on the formal statement was tabled by the end of the meeting. Margot moved to revisit it in 30 days. No one objected. Elena said she appreciated the board's consideration and moved to the next agenda item, her voice level and professional. Only Priya, taking minutes in the corner, noticed that her hands were pressed flat on the table in the particular way they got when she was working hard to hold something in. Daniel was in the lobby when she came down. She walked toward him, stopped a few feet away. The lobby wasn't empty, people moved through it in both directions, several of them recognizing her. And told him she was done managing this alone. That she'd been wrong about what alone was worth. That she was asking him not because she needed something from him, but because she was choosing it, because she wanted to if he was still in the same place he'd been the morning he left that envelope untouched on the nightstand. He said yes. He'd been in the same place the whole time. She nodded once, and then did something she hadn't done in the 6 months since the 40th floor. She let her face do what it wanted to do without managing it first. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just her expression, unguarded, for the first time and longer than she could measure. He saw it, and didn't look away. The stock recovered by the end of the following week. The press cycle closed, not because a statement went out, but because there was nothing left to speculate about. What had been hidden was simply visible now. A woman who ran a company, and a man who showed up, and the plain fact of them choosing each other in full view of everyone who'd been watching to see if they would. Eleanor's last letter stayed in Daniel's jacket pocket. He never needed to read it again. He'd already memorized the part that mattered.